let's talk about one of these particular artists that is kind of central in some ways to the whole book, which is Martin Scorsese, who is another one of these figures that is obviously so much of the now, such an incredibly frenetic, energized, passionate movie maker in Hollywood of all places, who nonetheless devotes several of his unbelievably extraordinary movies to religion, to Christianity, in fact. And in this particular era, he was struggling towards, it took him a long time, The Last Temptation of Christ, which became a kind of moment in the 80s, a big cultural moment. Tell me about Scorsese's faith and how that led to The Temptation.
Well, Scorsese grew up in Little Italy in Manhattan, and already then, he later said, he felt that the old Catholicism was passing away around him. And this is in the early 50s. He was an altar boy, and he was asthmatic, which meant that he didn't get to play sports like the other boys, so he was drawn to drawing, looking out the window at the passing show, and taking part in the rites of the Mass at the church, which was just a block away. So for him, art, faith, and his sense of the place where he could be himself all fit together from a very early age. Now, if you can believe it, from the time he was a teenager, he wanted to make a story about the crucifixion, a movie. He actually drew storyboards for it. And Scorsese is an incredible archivist. He still has them. So The Last Temptation of Christ, which he began making in the early 80s, fulfilled a wish that he'd had for 25 years already when he got around to making the picture. And as you say, he'd been in Hollywood. He'd been married several times. He'd had struggled with drugs and was kind of hyped up in the 70s the way so many other people were. But he felt out of joint living that life. And so in some ways, after he wound up in the hospital, he decided to change course a bit. And one way that he would honor that or carry it out would be by making this movie of the life of Christ that he'd wanted to make forever. And he gets going, and then he's thinking it's a way to get to know Jesus better. It's a devotional work. And at the time, though, in the early 80s, the religious right began to see things very differently, and they made a scapegoat of him in his film. And so this film, which I think came from completely pure intentions. It wasn't going to make a lot of money. He didn't want to scandalize people. He wanted to make this Jesus movie, which was a dream of his, ran right up into the culture wars in the mid-'80s.
But it wasn't any version. It was a particular novel. When did he come across that novel, and why did that novel particularly set him on choosing that narrative for his Jesus movie?
So The Last Temptation of Christ is a novel by Kazantzakis, a Greek Nobel laureate, published in the 50s, banned by the church or put on the index, as they said, at that time, and then rehabilitated after Vatican II. Barbara Hershey, who was an actress in several of Scorsese's movies, gave him the book in the early 70s. And he's busy. He read it across several years, but by the time he finished it around the time of Taxi Driver, he knew that he wanted to make a film out of it. And why? Well, Scorsese's work, seen in the broad sense, is about people who realize that they've got to work out their salvation in the streets instead of in the church. Essentially, that's the thrust of Mean Streets. It's said overtly, in the church by the protagonist of the film. And that's the thrust of a bunch of other films, the kind of Dostoevsky-like salvific angel in Taxi Driver, various figures in other movies. So Scorsese's Ars Poetica really is look for stories of salvation that are out in the street. So The Last Temptation of Christ, which for the most part follows the contours of Scripture, Jesus healing and attracting crowds and drawing the ire of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and so forth, then culminates on the cross in a dream sequence. And Jesus, as he's on the cross, has the last temptation. He dreams of coming down from the cross and living a conventional life, what we now call a bourgeois life, marrying Mary Magdalene and having children. And Scorsese, like Kazantzakis, imagines this scenario. So in effect, that's imagining Christ himself, working out his salvation in the streets instead of in his ministry. So it follows right along with Scorsese's aesthetic all along. But imagining Christ as married and even having sexual thoughts, you might think that the church would have actually approved of that, but the exact opposite happened. The right-wing Protestants ganged up on him for even imagining such a thing, much less depicting it. And then the Catholic hierarchy, many of whom hadn't seen the film, joined in, and they kind of rounded on him.
I remember it very well, actually, because I went to the movie as it was in its first week in Washington. And it's the first movie I've gone to I had to walk through a picket line to get into. And I sat there as, a relatively, I wasn't an unorthodox Catholic, particularly in how old was I then? In my late 20s, I think. And went in there with full expectation of being scandalized, I suppose, in some way, or shocked. I came out thinking it was one of the most beautiful statements of faith I'd ever seen.